Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Adam Pellegrini, Director of the Writing Center at CSSW, and I want to thank you for joining us for the Linda and Peter Hoffman Writing Lecture with Dr. Ellen Lukens. Really excited. Before we begin our program, I want to take care of a few housekeeping notes. First, this event is being recorded. For those of you joining us on Zoom, your microphone will be on mute. The chat is closed and any questions you may have for Dr. Lukens can be entered through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Questions will be answered during the last 20 minutes of the program. And now I'd like to introduce Dean Melissa Begg, who became the 18th Dean of Columbia School of Social Work on September 1st, 2019. Dean Begg is an accomplished scholar, committed educator, and creative administrative leader. We are fortunate to have her leading the School of Social Work. Dean Begg.
Thank you, Adam. And I appreciate your great work organizing today's lecture. Thank you for that. And thank you for your leadership of the school's Writing Center, which, as many of you know, is a great resource for our MSW and Ph.D. students and empowers them to become stronger, more confident writers throughout their careers. Now, a little bit of history. The Linda and Peter Hoffman Writing Lecture was founded in 2004. Through the generosity of a wonderful CSSW alum, Linda Hoffman, and her husband, Peter. Linda and Peter believe very strongly that administrative writing, especially the ability to write successful government and foundation grant proposals, is an essential skill for CSSW students and our alums. And that knowledge is based in direct work, crafting the vision, the direction, and the accomplishments of Linda's remarkably successful organization, the New York Foundation for Senior Citizens. And along with experts in proposal writing, this Hoffman Lecture has brought outstanding speakers and leaders to CSSW, such as Soraya Kohli, Deepa Iyer, and Marlon Preston, to speak to our community on the important aspects of inclusive writing and writing for advocacy and for justice. Now, Linda and Peter's generosity did not stop with the writing lecture. In addition to the lecture, every other year, the school awards the Linda and Peter Hoffman Writing Award to students who have written the best proposals, preferably for government funding. Since its inception in 2004, the Linda and Peter Hoffman Writing Award has presented to many, many students with exceptional writing skills at the CSSW commencement exercises. Now, as I noted earlier, Linda is the founder and president of New York Foundation for Senior Citizens. Established in 1968, the foundation aims to meet the needs of seniors throughout the New York's 5 boroughs, throughout all 5 boroughs of New York. I should know that because I'm from Queens. Now, through Linda's tireless leadership and commitment to aging New Yorkers, the foundation offers unique programming for seniors to enjoy healthier, safer, more productive, and more dignified lives. Now, its home sharing program for seniors is just one of the many programs for which the foundation has received numerous accolades, and understandably so. Linda's dedication and support of her graduate alma mater is remarkable. Among her many contributions, she's worked with Dean Emeritus Jeanette Takamura, and she served as chair as the Dean's Advisory Council at that time. She has also hired numerous CSSW graduates into staff positions at the foundation. Linda also wrote the foreword in a great book, The Columbia Guide to Social Work Writing. It's a leading and first of its kind publication that introduces social work writing and scholarship to a broad audience. We are so incredibly fortunate to have Linda as an alum of our school, and I believe she's actually here in our audience today. So welcome, Linda. We're glad that you're able to make it. And we are so grateful to you and Peter for making all of this possible and for your continued support of CSSW. So enough for me. Now it's my pleasure to make an introduction. It is a tremendous pleasure for me to introduce our presenter and a dearly beloved colleague here at CSSW, Dr. Ellen Lukens. Until she retired last summer, Dr. Lukens served as the Sylvia D. and Mose J. Firestone Centennial Professor of Professional Practice. And she's now the Firestone Professor Emerita. At CSSW, she taught many courses in the AGPP and Advanced Clinical Practice tracks, and also in the advanced practice track of the doctoral program. Now, she continues to work part-time as a research scientist and clinical supervisor at the New York State Psychiatric Institute. Dr. Lukens earned her MSW from Fordham and her PhD from Columbia. She is, as you know, an expert in the development of psychoeducational curricula for adolescents, adults, and families affected by severe trauma and mental health challenges. She has adapted and applied these interventions in the context of clinical, community, and even international practice, and is using the technique in a sort of train the trainer model and supervision. She's collaborated with teams in diverse settings around the world to design and implement these models, places such as Chile, Kazakhstan, Tanzania, Japan, Brazil, China, and of course, right here in New York City. Dr. Lukens, thank you for accepting this invitation today, and we're so excited to welcome you back to CSSW.
So my title today is What's on the Page is Not What Happens, Psychoeducation as a Frame for Grant Writing, Program Development, and Implementation. So what is psychoeducation? It's an evidence-based group approach that aims to synthesize, and this is the important part, synthesize therapeutic and educational strategies so that individuals, families, groups, or trainees can use, process, and apply information. And the idea is to build insight and self-awareness. And this is true both for the participants and for those who are either the trainers or the researchers, and et cetera. And then to learn in many different ways how to apply new knowledge in everyday life. It recognizes that learning about sensitive subjects may be personally challenging, and this is also really important, medically challenging and difficult to process, or all three. So what we've learned through psychoeducation is that timing is critical. You may tell something to someone 1 week, and 2 weeks later, they've completely forgotten it because they were so overwhelmed with the information, or it was just too much. So my goals for the talk are to draw the connections between and the implications for the clinical principles of psychoeducation and how they can be applied to the various aspects of writing in the context of a needs and assets assessment, grant writing, program development, evaluation and research. And I stress that actually evaluation and research are a bit different. Implementation science, and then sustainability. Sustainability becomes a very tricky issue in terms of the research and program development that we do, because very often it gets left in the dust. Increased community awareness, and very importantly, over time, public health prevention. So how did I come to psychoeducation? I was involved through my doctoral program. I was the project coordinator, project director, or research director for the Family Support Demonstration Project, which was a project funded by New York State to examine the impact of multiple family group psychoeducation on families of persons with schizophrenia. And the idea was to test out two different versions of group of psychoeducation, multiple family group psychoeducation and single family psychoeducation. I was involved in, then I got so interested in the research aspect of it that I also became very interested in the applied clinical aspects. And then fast forward, so this was in the early 90s, and this study was late 80s, early 90s. This study was turned out to be the seminal work on psychoeducation and the family. And a lot of the evidence moving forward is based on the research from that particular project. Fast forward to 9/11, and two colleagues and I, who I mentioned earlier, Hella Torning and Peggy O'Neill, decided that after September 11th, the psychoeducational ideas that we had used with schizophrenia would be very appropriate for healing after the shared trauma of September 11th. So we started with, we were funded by Project Liberty, and at that point they had significant money available. We did a full needs and assets assessment and then training in tandem with program development and implementation across 4 different cultures. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later. And then training and supervision over many years. I think we went 5 times in Kazakhstan, the Center for Family Education and Research at New York State Psych Institute, where I still supervise inpatient groups and have conducted research on those groups. And then, I don't know why this is showing at the bottom. And then a recent project that is still ongoing in Tanzania, which is an NIMH funded project, for which I'm co-investigator. The project is to introduce multiple family groups in the context of that particular culture for families with schizophrenia. So back to the work on schizophrenia. So yeah, it's a yeah, I'm trying to.
Can everyone please make sure that your cell phones are turned off? There's a ringing sound, and we're not sure that there's a.
So psychoeducation again gives the opportunity for the participants, and in this case the social workers alike, to exchange knowledge, collaborate, and learn together about a particular area of concern. It's evidence-based, starting with the work on multiple family groups, psychoeducation, and schizophrenia. And then a lot of the work following that is then evidence-informed. It's principle-based, and this is what I'm going to be talking about a little bit more, and I'll explain why that's important in a moment. Usually curriculum-driven. Curricula are also on the page, obviously, and that one never is able to follow your curriculum. It can play out very different, even in 2 different classes with the same material. And then to amplify knowledge. Now it's not going forward.
Oh.
Sorry about that. No, that didn't work either. It's just, I just need to click on it. Oh, sorry. Okay. I forgot. I knew this of a year ago. Okay. Okay. So a psychoeducation is a well-described evidence-based practice in which it's very important to bear witness, the concept of bearing witness to the narrative. It promotes knowledge exchange, both professional and local knowledge. By professional, it's what we as professionals bring to the table. The local knowledge is the everyday knowledge of the people in the room. The identification and recognition of typical response patterns, and this can have a very calming effect, both for trainees and for students, for people who are in care. And then the importance of contextualization. So the evidence behind psychoeducation is based on multiple randomized trials, including on schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, depression, and also cancer. Those studies address the impact on individual and family, and then additional studies around the world on PTSD, parenting, elder care, medical disorders, and also, interestingly, reconciliation and reparation in countries in Africa. The theoretical framework includes theories and models related to both education and clinical practice, including the overarching ecological systems theory, trauma and recovery models, narratives, and I'll talk more about stories, cognitive behavioral theory, group theory, both social support and network theory, and social learning theory, and then the theory behind curriculum design, which I don't know that we think about that often. And these are the key principles, and this is where I want to sort of ground what I'm talking about. The first one builds on Freire's work that knowledge is power. The importance of identifying and practical strategies for coping in the context of well-being and strengths. So being able to identify strengths in the face of trauma and stress, as opposed to just focusing on the negatives. Collaboration and exchange, I've already talked about that. And then cultural relevance and humility. Humility is important. Anti-oppressive practice, power, race, intersectionality, context, and also very importantly, history. Narratives and stories, as I've already talked about, and the importance of sustainable work. So the specific aims are to create secure settings and connections. So security and feeling like there's a space is critical. Sharing stories. I can't emphasize that enough. This exchange of stories can be incredibly powerful in terms of work across different settings and structures, identifying personal reactions and triggers. So very often in our work, we, as we're working with, even with a community or in the field, something triggers us. And being able to recognize that and understand what's going on becomes incredibly important, because otherwise it gets in the way of the work. To deepen insight and psychological flexibility, and then to reduce conflict and stress. And this sets the stage for building supports, friendships, opportunities for advocacy, and advocacy becomes part of sustainability. I think that's really important to emphasize. And then the importance of extending community knowledge and prevention. So back to the public health piece. And so from the earliest stages of grant writing, the principles can serve to ground a very formal and structured intervention that shifts over time. This is where the what's on the page doesn't happen. And or both and, which I know Professor Kapadia loves to address. And to promote a brief exchange in the moment that focuses on, and here there are tiny interventions that can be very, very powerful, to promote a brief exchange in the moment that focuses on connection, shared decision making, or support. So, so I was looking up implementation science, and this was the first thing I came to. It was from an NIH toolkit, and I thought, this really doesn't say a lot. Like, oh my God. So I thought, well, there is some work to be done in terms of thinking about what implementation science means. So I created a non-static, this is just a beginning, but a non-static diagram that shows, a Venn diagram that shows you could be the social worker, the researcher, the program, the grant writer, the individual, the family, the community, the participants, and importantly, the funder, which sometimes we forget about. And then the context and culture, systems, history and timing, assumptions, stigma, and prop. Here we should include intersectionality as well. And you can see there's a very small chunk in the middle, but hopefully that can grow over time. So, and this is definitely non-static. So this made me a little happier than the NIH. So what I wanted to do is to intertwine some examples from the field with the principles. So the first one was knowledge is power. And this, the idea is to build knowledge out, information. And at the bottom, I have data, information, knowledge, and wisdom. Data is just, it just could be a whole bunch of books thrown on the floor of a library. And then if you pull that together, you've got maybe you've got some information, but translating that so people really understand it is where knowledge comes in. And I think that's really critical. One of the other pieces, it's ongoing and non-static and ongoing for us and them, whoever they are. And always from the top down and bottom up. So one of the most interesting things in the original family support project was the project, Bill McFarlane, who was the innovator behind all of this, asked that we train everyone in our sites, including the administrators, the people at the front desk, the people in the mailroom, so that everybody was on the same page in terms of the project. And I always found that so fascinating because then we never really had challenges in terms of engagement. So I talked about the everyday knowledge. And then there was this was before I even knew anything about psychoeducation. When I was still a student, I was a student at Psych Institute. A woman came in and was very, very concerned about her adolescent daughter. And she was crying in my office. And I thought, oh my God, I have no idea what to do. And so, and she couldn't describe, she had no words to describe what was going on with her daughter, who it turned out had some kind of combined depression and suicidal ideation. And so I didn't know what to do. So I pulled up the DSM and we looked at it together. And for some reason that really calmed her down. And I think that was my first real, again, without knowing that, I think that was a form of psychoeducation. So anyway, she then became very involved in the National Alliance on Mental Illness and became a real advocate, and her daughter grew up to be fine, interestingly. So that was good too, had a good outcome. The second one is the importance of exchange. So, and here I want to emphasize, I've spoken to some of these points, but the importance of positionality. So who are we in the room? And then how that plays out in terms of reciprocity. So one important piece is the idea of using user-friendly information and ideas to promote health and mental health literacy. Because early on, again, in an early lecture that I gave to families of people with schizophrenia, I remember that as people in the room were looking at me like, really? And somebody later said, you know, you were using words that we just don't understand. And then recognizing that time and timing, as I said earlier, and space and silence are really important in terms of the work, and that implementation starts at the beginning. So in terms of building relationships. So after September 11th, my colleagues and I were, one of the communities we worked with was the Arab American community in Sunset Park. And we went to introduce our idea of psychoeducational groups for the community, working with imams. And it was a pretty large community group, and somebody raised their hand very early on and said, "Are you from the FBI?" And so it took some work to build those relationships for obvious reasons. And then this is fast forward to 2018, I was in Dar es Salaam doing a training for the NIMH project. And NIMH wanted my slides in advance, and I had my 200 slides, and the back of my head, I thought, this is never going to work. And so I went into the room, everybody, I was speaking in English, everybody spoke English, but mostly they don't speak English, they speak Swahili during every day. And I probably was standing up, which was a big mistake. And they all looked at me like after about 15 minutes, like I had rocks in my head. And I said, okay, this is really not working. And so I said, let's just talk. So I sat down and we just had a real exchange. And it turned out that we were able to use a lot of the ideas that I came with, and we used a lot of the ideas from a project they had actually done. So this project was focusing on schizophrenia, as I said, but they wanted to share a lot of ideas from a project that they had developed for AIDS. And women in Tanzania. So we were able to combine those, which was really fascinating. And then emphasis on well-being and strengths in the context of culture and anti-oppressive practice. How does this vary by culture? So the four communities that we worked in after 9/11 were the Arab American community, as I mentioned, the Dominican American community in Upper Manhattan, the Chinese American community in Lower Manhattan, and the Native American community in their offices were then in Chelsea. And what was so interesting was how, as we worked with each of them and developed the model and adapted it for the different communities, how important so food was really important in the Arab American community. Tea was really important in Chinatown. Stories were important everywhere. And ceremony was really important with the Native American community. So figuring out how to merge that into a model, that where it just really helped to be drawing on the principles as opposed to, trying to start from scratch with each of these. And then narratives and stories. And I love this quote from a recent novel by Michael Ondaatje. I know how to fill in a story from a grain of sand or a fragment of discovered truth. I thought that was beautiful. The difference between thin stories where somebody just talks very briefly about something like 2 or 3 lines, or a very thick story where you really get the richness of what's going on. And then how people recognize themselves in stories. This was particularly true in working with the Native American community and how they use stories to transform or communicates their history and their beliefs. And then I have a really interesting example for the Tower of Language and Narratives and Stories. This is a small, what on the surface of it was a quick thing that happened in the elevator at Psych Institute last week. My colleague, Amy Acosta, who said I could share this story, got on the elevator, and there were a group of people who were from the inpatient unit who had just come from an outdoor gym, past courses enclosed and locked. And she got on the elevator and she said, "Oh, where were you?" And then somebody said, "We were at the gym." And she said, "It's such a nice day. I'm stuck in here." And from the back of the elevator, somebody said, "Amy, you're not stuck. We're stuck." And I thought that was such a powerful story. So psychoeducation is partially performed through stories, and stories work with stories help people with conflict resolution with others, with themselves, with the team, in terms of community development. They help in terms of building critical thinking and self-reflection and insight, and a shared and collective experience, the construct of I'm not alone. So, and then cultural relevance and humility. The translation is not enough. It's important to create a common language, but that can be really tricky with the limitations of translation. And I think I'm not bilingual. I really wish I were, but when I know from speaking to people who are, that sometimes trying to translate an idea from one culture to another can be really challenging. So that means that attention to the context, to the historical and cultural context is critical, as is attention to anti-oppressive practice and intersectionality and crop. And then attention to life stage and history and context. So after September 11th, the 2 colleagues that there were 3 white women working who came up with the original idea. But we realized that was not really workable in terms of trying to build connections with the communities. And because we did have sufficient funding, we were able to hire social workers from each of the communities who were bilingual. And then that was our sort of central team. And then we used the trainer model out in the community. And the other thing that was really interesting in terms of working with the Native American community, there are apparently somewhere between 70 and 100,000 people who are Native American in New York City, which I had never realized. There was a lot of ambivalence after 9/11 from that community. Some because there were a lot of people from that community volunteered in the pit, as they referred to it. And at the same time, there's a lot of history there that's pretty intense and negative. So in terms of working in that with folks in that community, there was a lot to sort of navigate and negotiate. And these are our principles, which have evolved a little bit over the years, but in the 4 languages, I just thought you'd be interested. And then building sustainable practice and implementation. So thinking about the application and importantly, the intersectionality of all the principles, the importance of ongoing supervision. I think training is not enough. You really need ongoing supervision. I supervise students, one of them is here, who co-facilitate groups with people on the inpatient unit at Psych Institute. And I encourage them to debrief after every session and then write up a summary of what they remember. And then we talk about it in the supervision. And that has also led to a lot of revision of the sort of the curriculum for those groups over the years. So again, it's non-static. The idea of learning collaboratives, this is something that the state has used in terms of work with people with severe mental illness over the years, in terms of bringing together teams, differing teams from differing settings to talk about cases or challenges in implementation, et cetera. Self-help groups. And then the whole idea of amplifying and extending community knowledge and its implications for public and mental health. And then what's so interesting in both the New York State project back in the late 80s, early 90s, the folks from those groups continued to meet as self-help groups after the intervention. And the same thing has happened in Tanzania, which I find really so fascinating. So people get on board with these ideas and then they run with it, which is really important to think about. In Chinatown, what was so interesting was there was a lot of pushback again after 9/11 that people were so hungry for individual work that they didn't want to use a group model. But we convinced, it was one of our doctoral students who had left and was then the head of clinical programs there. And so I was able to convince him to at least try it. And then they've really embraced the groups, and they use a lot of group models in not just psychoeducation in Chinatown now. It's important again to use user-friendly language. The idea of leveling the hierarchy. It's not, so it's the professional and the everyday knowledge are equally important. So in anthropological terms, it's thinking of the experience near, the lived experience, and the experience far, the professional experience, and looking for the synergy between those. So the researcher, the community contributions and voices include the researcher brings knowledge of the broad knowledge. The community brings their culture and strengths. We've worked with many people, at least some of us have, many people with some of these illnesses over time, but the people in the community have to live with this every day, and they're the ones that follow it. When we leave, they don't. So that's important to remember. Modeling, I think, happens in both directions. And then the community brings their own structure and culture. And I think it really takes time to really honor that and be aware of what it is. I thought this was just the concept of the authorized knower. This is just to counter to stress the importance of the everyday and the professional. We hold control over a body of knowledge, and that means that people tend to listen to and defer to us, which can be really problematic. So how do we counter that? I don't think that says why we counter it. Yeah, because, and what happens is that it creates fear. And I know this happens in the folks that we work with on the inpatient unit, because we have to, as social workers, we have to talk a lot with them about how to feel secure enough to ask questions of their psychiatrists or their social workers or whoever it might be. It's the white coat syndrome. So our presence and our communication style, listening and connecting through words becomes really important. Back to bearing witness and checking our power and privilege and positionality. Back to thinking again of me as a white American going to Tanzania with my 200 slides. It just was not going to work. And then to reflect on principles of shared decision-making, which is work from the arena of schizophrenia, but I just think it's a really interesting work that we could draw on. The example in Tanzania really speaks to that, is that you make decisions in tandem with the person that you're working with or the community that you're working with, as opposed to just imposing. And some of the key characteristics of shared decision-making are attention, time, listening, space, silence. I just heard the term dynamic silence, which I thought was a really beautiful phrase. Physical therapist just told me that she used that in her yoga practice. And I thought, her yoga teaching, I thought that was interesting. Very, very powerful image. And the importance of attending to body language. So you have to, picking up, you can't just listen to the words. You have to watch the what's going on in the room as well. And the other important thing is titrating content. So making sure that when you're talking about an idea, it's not too complex or too much, or too little or too simple. So the challenge is then moving beyond simple education to psychoeducation, and creating space so that people can absorb and process and reflect. And the fact that when you present information in everyday terms so that people can take it in, it can increase personal agency or community agency, and and the information without context can be intimidating and actually can be frightening. So and I think we've all experienced that when we've gone to a doctor's office and they've explained things and they've talked really fast and they only have 10 minutes and they don't want to do any shared decision making. And, we've all been on the other end as well as the professional end. So the idea is that psychoeducation is not just education alone, it's more than the sum of its parts. And the idea is to aim toward the synergy, and I earlier said clinical and educational intervention, but I think at a community level, it's really restorative and educational intervention. So we're integrating our values, culture, context, positionality, and history. This is now sort of summarizing different methods of learning, intersectionality, the individual and the community voice, how information impacts dynamics and access, the importance of narratives again, and life stage. So what gets in the way? Isms. the stigma among all of us, both internalized and structural. Professor Kapadia teaches a whole course on this. Power and privilege. Impatience and anger. Sometimes what's going on in our own life gets translated to the situation in unexpected ways, and really being able to check that and realize when it happens. Access is really important. So I think one of the things I remember a while back at Presbyterian Hospital, they decided they really had to upgrade their signage in the hallways, and I thought that was a really powerful. Somehow I was in on that discussion. I'm not sure why, but I remember thinking, wow, I wouldn't have thought of that, but it really is critical in terms of people just being able to function within a scary situation, which is a hospital. So I don't really know if they did that or not, but they did. And then access to simple lack of access to information. So the expectation that you know when you're in a situation what's going to happen, when in fact you probably have no idea. So, and then for us, what are the facilitators? Just being real and admitting when you don't know. Again, watching the body language. So in Tanzania, recognizing that everybody was spacing out. They weren't using cell phones, which was really nice, but they were really spacing out. Considering the context, the whole idea of reflective listening, which I learned from the work here on motivational interviewing, which is a really powerful tool. And then again, debriefing. Thinking about humility. Humility is a powerful word. The importance of gentle humor. Again, the importance of literal versus and cultural translation. Micro interactions, what a colleague refers to as a small fullness, which I can talk about later. Collaboration, sensitivity to difference and positionality, time and timing, and then respect. And I have a quote on respect that I wanted to share that and this author writes, it sees the danger of respect conceived as the mere acceptance or appreciation of difference. In that form, respect can stymie dialogue and mutual learning. I thought that was a really brilliant quote. So it's a collaborative model where everybody serves as an educator, a student, a translator, a consultant, an advocate, a monitor, facilitator. And in sum, the principles allow us to consider structuring content, ongoing engagement, it's non-static, positionality, accountability, which is really key, an active collaboration, going back to the funders, the team and the community, and then time and timing. So thank you.
Thank you for a wonderful talk.
Oh,
I really enjoyed it. Yeah, no, I wrote down so many things that I want to ask you about. It's going to be hard to keep tabs on that, but I'll start with a few questions if that's okay. And then we'll ask folks in the audience if they would like to pose some, and then thankfully Dean Greenwich will monitor online so we can bring in some questions from our online participants as well. But thank you for that framing. I'm going to go. I was really intrigued by you referred to intersectionality a lot. And I'm wondering about how you integrate that specifically into grant writing and program development. And then my head is going to principles of social justice and racial justice and advocacy, which you also talked about. Right. How does that filter into your process?
I think it's really important just to begin with that and remind oneself or one's team, or the team should remind themselves that that's so central going forward. So again, that it's non-static, and you can't just say that at the beginning and then think that it's going to be, it's going to be central all the way through. I think it's something we have to constantly check.
Yeah.
Because it's really, really easy to forget that. Yeah. So
you made me understand translational work to a better degree today. So thank you for that. So
Oh.
for a long time, I've thought a lot about interdisciplinary work and the power of that and moving us forward. And often you're comparing what's translational versus what's interdisciplinary. And you said something when you said translation is not the same as developing a common language. That really hit me because one is so much harder than the other. And I think to really, translational, I'm sitting here and you're sitting there and we can translate back and forward and stay in our corners in a way almost. And just wondering how you're thinking about that, because I'm thinking interdisciplinary in a different way. Is that what you had in mind when you said that?
No, that's an interesting question. So translation, I think it's just so easy. I mean, there was that film called Lost in Translation. I think it's just so easy to get lost in the midst of trying to work in a culture different than one's own. I remember flying back from Tanzania, I was talking to a woman next to me who I didn't know, and we were talking about the complexity of the work. And the man behind us, as we stood up and said, yeah, I know what you're saying, and it doesn't get easier. It gets more and more complicated. And I think that's true. I think you have to really stay with it in order to honor difference.
Yeah. And the deeper you get in, the more you find
it gets more complicated. I think.
Yeah, I think that totally makes sense. Another thing I wanted to ask you about was just at a very high level, if we think about writing. So there's a lot of writing behind everything that you shared with us, whether it was writing program evaluation or a grant proposal or a paper for publication, whatever that was. How would you say you approach these tasks? How do they differ depending on what kind of product you're trying to create? And do you have particular strategies that help you address those different challenges?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So, and this all started when I was in high school, because I took a course in my junior year on journalism, and I was the feature editor for my high school newspaper. And one of the key maybe all I remember from that class was the 5 W's and the H: who, what, when, where, why, and how. And I used that when I taught AGPP, and I use it with my doctoral students. I use it in terms of all the aspects of writing, that if you can answer those questions, then you've summarized it and you've got to start.
Yeah.
So
start. Yeah, you're right at the starting point.
Yeah.
You also had a phrase on one of your slides was "remember the funder."
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, could you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah. Well, so I think before I went to Tanzania, I should have done a little bit of psychoeducation with the funder from NIMH,
right.
because when I had all those slides, I thought I knew it. I just wasn't fully conceptualized in my head, but I kept being sort of uncomfortable with these 200 slides I had. So I think, constant negotiation and working with and informing a funder and helping them. That's a bad word. But really exchanging ideas with them as so that you're on the same page all the way along would be really helpful. And I understand why they want to have a plan ahead of time.
Sure. They need to know what they're investing in.
So it's layered.
Well, I have to say, if you don't someday write a book or a paper that's called "Me 200 Slides in NIMH," I will be very disappointed, because that's one of the best lines I've ever seen on a slide. Because it told a lot. And what would you say is the difference between, say, writing a proposal for funding, some sort of grant application, versus a research paper, for example? What are you trying to do there?
Yeah, so for a proposal for funding is really a plan. Yeah, I mean, it's a and it's a strategy, and you really have to. I mean, a lot of the grants that I've gotten have been in response to RFPs, responses, requests for proposal, and you have to be really careful to attend to all those little bits and the weird language that you saw on that one slide that doesn't always say a lot. So, and figuring how to interpret that in your grant and at the same time address what the funder wants.
Yeah.
In a research paper, it's very different because you've done the research and then you're really trying to think of how to tell and I think telling the story is really important to make sure that's why I think narratives are so important, so to make it come alive in the context of the work. Otherwise, I mean, research papers can be very dull if they're not, so.
Yeah, well, someone who came from a very quantitative background,
Yeah.
took me decades to realize the importance of narrative and
Yeah.
how essential it is and how powerful it can be. Is, you know,
You're right.
you don't have to throw the data away, like together that they can be really powerful. But so sticking with this notion of narrative and its importance, can you say a little bit more about the role of narrative in psychoeducation? That seems to be central.
Yeah, I think it's really central, and I've come to think that, you know, narrative can be one line story. It could be either, I mean, what is in the New York Times, they have the Metropolitan Diary, they have the tiny love stories. I mean,
Yeah, modern love
or whatever it is.
Yeah.
But there's little stories that from the work that can really communicate more than, you know, 5 lines of data.
Yep.
You know what I mean?
Absolutely. Yeah, it makes you understand it at a more core level, maybe that's the way to say it. Yeah.
And then the importance of joining qualitative and quantitative methods. I find that really critical to the work.
Yeah. Have you relied on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to do both.
Yeah.
Because they really complement each other. And I think for a long time that wasn't as recognized as it should be.
I think that's true.
Yeah.
I think that's true, definitely. Yeah. So getting better on that front.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's good. I have like a million more questions, but let me take a pause here and ask folks in the room. Anybody would like to pose a question? Yes, please.
First, Dr. Lukens, thank you for such a splendid talk. Early in your lecture, you talked about psychoeducation as being important in reconciliation and reparation work in Africa. Could you give us an example of that? Because that is new to me. I didn't realize psychoeducation had been used in that way.
No, it's such an interesting, I mean, I don't have the reference on the top of my head. However, I would have to track it down. However, there was some really interesting work in terms of people understanding how to talk to each other after a cultural trauma, and using some of these principles to set up ways to structure that and embrace it. I do not think there was would be evidence informed. I don't think there were any formal research studies on that, but clearly they were thinking about the idea of information and knowledge exchange as the basis and the foundation for helping people see eye to eye who had not done that, been able to do that before. So. But I could probably track down the reference if you're interested. It was really very interesting work. So, yeah.
Sounds it.
Yeah.
I will go to Dean Greenwich. Do we have any questions coming in from our online audience?
No questions yet, just accolades. Everyone is really, really excited that you are here.
Wonderful. Well, some questions were submitted ahead of time, so I'm going to be not so selfish and won't ask another of mine. But so someone wrote ahead of time, in your opinion, does the psychosocial model increase the chances of a successful grant proposal?
Yeah, I saw that question and I thought, no, that's a really interesting question. Not necessarily. I mean, I think it's yeah. I mean, I think
there are no guarantees in life here.
No, I mean, I think, and it wouldn't. It's certainly, again, because I've responded to requests for proposals. I mean, very often that would not be an aspect of a grant proposal, so it would be very appropriate in some situations and not in others.
Okay.
I mean, yeah. I mean, I'm not sure what they exactly meant by psychosocial either.
Yeah.
Like, it's not psychoeducational. Even
Yeah.
psychoeducation wouldn't be appropriate
Okay.
for every grant.
Yeah.
But I think the structure and the context and the cultural aspects would be critical for pretty much any grant.
Yeah. You talked a lot about context, I think, as
Yeah.
I think about your
Yeah.
slides and what you presented. So that makes sense. And places where psychoeducational models would not be appropriate, I guess, I don't know if that means in grant writing or in other domains, but
Yeah, no, that's a good question too.
yeah.
I mean, I think, yeah, I do think that people have to really think about this model in order to implement it. So I think you would want to really get through. I mean, I've been doing this for so many years that it comes very naturally to me. However, I think that it would be really important to think about, to really think through the structure and the principles in order to apply it. So if you couldn't do that, or you didn't really buy into it, then it would be difficult to implement, I think.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It does. Makes
Yeah.
complete sense. Thank you. Yeah. Any other? Yeah, Dr. Kapadia. Could you turn on the mic, Amy? Sorry.
I can. Is that better?
Yes.
First of all, it's an honor to be with you today. So thank you for your amazing talk. And for those of you who don't know, I've probably learned pretty much everything from Dr. Lukens. So it really is special. I have a question about community work, because a lot of people are if they're familiar with psychoeducation, they're more familiar with individual or group work. So could you speak to the community level approaches with psychoeducation?
Yeah, and I think that's what we did that was particularly applicable in the work after September 11th, when we were moving amongst different cultures and communities. And Amy, you were involved in that when you were a doctoral student. So, so the challenge there was really identifying the strengths in each community, and sort of the nuances in terms of openness to collaboration. I think the time that takes in terms of community work, I mean, it's very different than if you're, so for example, on an inpatient unit where we've got a captured audience, literally, as opposed to in a community where there's a lot of ambivalence, as there was when they asked if we were from the FBI. So there's a lot of sometimes backtracking and back work that has to be done in order to even get to step one. And actually, I know you've encountered that in your own work. So.
Thank you. Thank you. Anything on that? Yeah, Adam, please.
I don't really have a thought through question, but I'm just sitting with that that idea of one-line stories and all of the really wonderful snippets or anecdotes that you've shared in the last hour. Just thinking about narrative and how you came to be someone who kind of gathers and like incorporates these sort of like bite-sized things that people say to you in a very rich way, because the things that you shared, I think you see a lot of richness, and even though they're sort of small like sentences, like a sentence somebody said to you is that you seem to have sat with. And I guess as I'm saying it out loud, working up to a question would be something like, yeah, how did you come to that practice of listening in that way? And
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I think that comes from all the work I did with people diagnosed with schizophrenia, because one of the sort of labels that people have with that illness is they have limited or little insight. And after facilitating groups for myself and then supervising groups, first with families and people with the illness together, and then with the people with the illness only, what I came to realize is that I probably learned as much about schizophrenia from listening to their sentences, literally sentences, as I did from all the billion books I read about schizophrenia. So I remember, and when I taught the course that Amy now teaches on evidence-based practice for schizophrenia, I used a lot of quotes from the group. So I remember one person saying, and to me, this really sticks in my head. This was a person in a group that I facilitated. Everything I do every day is stressful. And I thought, wow, that really speaks to what this illness does to people more than a whole textbook. So that's
tables and graphs, right?
Our own team, yeah. So I just found, I guess, just the humility that comes to really listening to people and recognizing what they're dealing with is really powerful. So then I got really interested in sentences.
Not
Yeah.
diagramming them, but yeah, the content.
Right.
Yeah. It was fascinating to hear about the 9/11 study and you've also done a lot of international work. So I'm wondering, what are the kinds of challenges did you face in the September 11th studies and kinds of challenges in international studies, and
What were the
did they
differences?
reflect on each other at all?
Yeah.
Did you learn something
Well,
from one to
the
the
one
other?
thing that was common in New York City after September 11th was we were all in it together, regardless of culture. You know, even, I mean, obviously this played out very differently in the different communities and there's different stigmas attached. However, it brought out this sort of patriotism or Americanism or something that became very central. There was ambivalence in the Native community. Well, maybe I'm exaggerating because there was a lot of ambivalence in different ways, but still there was this sort of common energy. Working in international settings, there's always a skepticism, you know, as a white person coming into a country that might be, you know, and being also an American, you know, that's where the Americans aren't looked at so necessarily favorably. So I think those were the very different kinds of challenges that we had to navigate.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, thank you. Other audience questions? Yes. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you again for your lecture. My question has to do, so you gave us some great quotes and things that you've experienced with respect to NIH. I was wondering if you could say whether in your experience, you have seen different trends with respect to NIH, what they are willing to fund versus not fund. And for example, narrative, qualitative work, not always appreciated. So what are your experiences and what are the lessons learned in terms of writing when you have seen trends move, come and go?
No, it's a great question. I mean, I think that NIMH in particular is more open now to qualitative work, especially in terms of the preliminary work. So in terms of building in a real needs and assets assessment based on focus groups or qualitative data collection. And I think in terms of international work, that's particularly critical. So I think there has been, I mean, that certainly was true for the funding for the Tanzania project, which it's funded through Duke. And my colleague is on the PI is on the faculty at UNC social work. I can't speak, you know, that's really the one that I've been most involved in the last 4, 5, 6 years, sort of pre-funding and then through the funding phase and now as it's being implemented. But in general, I don't know if this is, I think that it's been a long time coming in terms of qualitative, being appreciation for qualitative data. So, yeah.
Thank you. On that theme of applying for grants, whether it's from NIH or other funders, it feels like to me that rejection is an unavoidable aspect of the life of a grant writer.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, and it can be hard to take, although you get used to it after a while, I guess. But what are your thoughts on that? And do you have any tips for folks just starting out, maybe, or in the midst of their careers and having to balance that and keep doing the work and keep getting back in the classroom to teach and doing the mentoring and doing the research you already got funded for, and then still writing these grants?
Yeah, you just have to keep going. And I think one of the most heartbreaking projects that I worked on was one in which Professor Kapadia was involved, where there was a team of us that worked so hard to do a psychoed project in Kenya and Brazil. And we got amazing feedback from the funding team, and we were so proud of it, and we worked so hard and we revised, and then we didn't get it. And However, the team went on and applied for a smaller grant and did the whole thing on a very tiny budget. So,
You got to be nimble and creative.
so that was the power. I was out at that point, but my colleagues took it on and ran with it, I was really pleased with that.
Yeah.
So
Oh, that's a great story.
we didn't get the money, but we did it anyway.
Did it anyway.
Good.
Any other questions there? All right, good. And I'm thinking back to days of being a grant reviewer and wondering about your experiences there and how that impacted your life as a grant writer.
Yeah. So I actually have never been on an NIH panel.
Okay.
I have reviewed grants for this at the state level.
Yep.
And it is really a learning experience because for me, I'm really interested in words, and people use a lot of words.
Yeah, they do. Throw them around a lot.
So figuring out how to sort of cut through the how
We're
to
going to bleep that out.
to cut through all the words and really try to figure out what
trying to
people,
say.
yeah, I think that's the most important.
Yeah.
And I have written NIMH grants that I did not get, and then getting the feedback is really daunting.
Yes. Yes.
Because then, you really see what people, you realize where you weren't clear, or, you have to be so clear
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
check and check and
Yeah.
check.
You've got to be succinct and clear, and it's really hard, right? Who was it who said, I was going to write you a short letter, but I didn't have time, something like that, right? Like it's easy
Yeah.
to sort of put a lot of words, as
Yeah.
you just said, but
Yeah.
to try to get to the essence and make a compelling case is a different challenge altogether. I can't believe the time is almost done. Yeah, we have one more. We have a question from. Oh, good. Huh.
So from Blaze, which grants were the most successful in Tanzania and which grants were the least successful is
Oh,
the first.
so there's
Chuck.
only one grant in Tanzania.
Okay.
So, it was success, or it is, I think it's success, but it's ongoing. And, there are always interesting challenges along the way. So for example, I think there are 4 sites, 3 of them are adopting it and moving forward, but for whatever reason, we can't exactly figure out. The 4th site is just sort of dropped it. And it's hard. And I was talking to the PI about this a couple of weeks ago, and we were just trying to take apart what happened, because one of the people involved was pretty central to all the planning and implementation. So it's hard to know, but it's a great question. Yeah. So.
Thank you. And final question, for settings that may not be as familiar with psychoeducation, especially in settings outside of mental health, how can we as social workers incorporate it? I'm thinking about employee assistance or more corporate settings that may not be as common.
Oh, that's a really good question. I mean, I think taking this model, that's where the train the trainers model could come in. So if social workers really were interested in using it in employee assistance, which I think would be a perfect setting, social workers could take the principles and then apply it around domestic violence or I don't know, drug addiction or something like, different issues that people that might be facing, or even interpersonal disputes in the work setting. So I think it would have to be really thought through, and probably some focus groups with people to figure out what's needed, but yeah.
One final one just came in.
No, never say final.
Right. I feel like it's encouraging people to put more in. Any tips on asking for feedback from funders without being too pushy?
That's a good question.
That is a good question.
It's a delicate thing.
With a smile. I mean, be gracious. But yes, so I do remember a grant we didn't get where I asked for feedback, and I think they wouldn't give it. And then I thought, you know what? I don't know if they even read it. I mean, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, you have to be, it's the balance between maybe timing. I talked about timing. Yeah, that's a really hard question.
it's hard to put that much effort into something and feel like they didn't read it, right? Which
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure they did read
That's
it,
it.
but they didn't give, I don't think
they read it quickly or
they read it
yeah,
quickly or
they
something.
had a lot of other things going on like we all do.
Yeah,
Yeah, that is hard.
Yeah.
right? But, yeah.
yeah, I mean, you have to write a lot of grants to get some.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah. And the trick is to keep at it, I think. And to try to discern, I guess, the right and what you can learn from the feedback,
Yeah,
even when it's
yes.
aggravating. right?
Yeah.
But do you have any examples of that in your head when you're writing something and I don't know.
I'm just being open. I mean, one of my, and this, I share with my students or my colleagues, I think everybody needs a good editor. No matter how good a writer you are, you need a good editor. And I think it's, presumptuous not to assume that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So,
So do you as a practice or have you as a practice always shared your writing with others
Yeah,
before? And how did you pick those people? Who does that for you or
Well,
with you?
people whose writing I like, or people whose writing I respect, or people whose writing who share some of my ideas, or my colleagues,
Right.
and particularly around the psychoeducational issues.
Yeah.
Yeah, people who, and it would be also useful to get, I mean, one of the in qualitative methods, one of the important aspects of that is member checking. So getting feedback from the people who you're talking to.
Yeah.
I mean, who you're writing about. So as well, if you're doing a qualitative piece. So
Yeah. I can imagine that could change things quite a bit.
yeah, it can change quite a bit.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Interesting.
the different aspects of writing.
Yeah. Is there, if you think back on it, is there any one thing you know now that you kind of wish you'd known before you started your career in writing? And I don't know if that goes back to that high school features editor role or your role as a professor. There's something you wish you'd known then that would have helped, you think?
Just the important, I think especially not to procrastinate, it's easy for me to procrastinate with writing. I'm not
Yeah.
sure why, because I like to write. So,
Yeah.
but it's always easy to do address the things on the list first.
Yep.
Even when I was writing my dissertation, I mean,
Yep.
well, maybe that's what everybody does when they write it.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah.
So, and to really live up to some of the things I talked about, and not to forget all these principles. I think, yeah.
Yeah, hard to keep all that in mind while you're a very busy professor
Yeah.
and researcher. If you, let me put this two ways, I guess. Maybe what's the best advice you ever received as a writer? Or I can give you the option to share with our audience members, what's the one piece of advice you would like to leave them with, do you think?
Well, I think, and this comes from teaching with Professor Wu, to really think outside the box and not, and often I would push back against him, but he, it really does help to have ideas that aren't traditional, and to try to be creative in terms of the thinking about the work, and to really listen. Yeah. And also, and I guess to always be conscious of positionality and prop. I mean, I think that's, the work that we've done here in the school around those issues has been so critical in terms of sort of attending to intersectionality and issues of who I am in relationship to the people I'm working with.
Yep.
So.
Yeah, and how that can impact the work and the framing.
Yeah. So that's a bunch of things, but.
Yeah, well, they're all important.
Yeah.
Important. Any other questions online or? Yeah, okay.
I train people with a neuroscientific model that I've developed to overcome their fear of public speaking. How would I go about finding someone to mentor me in writing a grant?
Wow.
Yeah.
That, I don't know if I have an answer to that. That's a great question.
I bet people have written to you out of the blue throughout your career to say, could you give me some advice? Has that happened? And what was the outcome?
I don't, has that happened?
Yeah.
I
I mean, students here, maybe,
Yeah.
right? And
You know, the foundation, I guess probably where I would send somebody would be the foundation center. When I first started teaching AGPP, I did do their online training. Well, that point it was in-person training on how to write a grant proposal, and I think that probably was the most helpful. I mean, it's hard to be. I mean, I guess the other idea would be to ask whoever is the potential funder if there's somebody that they could collaborate with. I mean, certainly that's what we've done in various situations, not always successfully, but it can be really, really helpful as well.
Yeah.
That sort of partially answers the question.
Yeah.
I don't know of a single source, so.
Are there books and things that you
And
think are useful? Yeah.
there are a lot of books that
Yeah.
can be a little dry, but
But if you're really determined to get the grant,
Yes.
you're gonna have to put up with.
yeah, so.
Yeah, I was thinking too, that often we're reluctant to write to people we don't know, but if there's someone that this person admires and could write to them to say, do you have any tips? You know, if
Yeah.
there's someone whose career you wanted to emulate, for example. It's
Yeah.
often very flattering to get an email out of the blue from somebody you don't know saying, I really admire what you've done. So
Yeah. Yeah.
you'd be surprised sometimes. I don't
Yeah,
know.
and yeah. Or reaching out to, one thing I I've suggested to doctoral students over the years, if you read an article and you really have questions about it, is to reach
Yeah.
out to the author. I mean,
Yep.
it's not unheard of, and as you say, people are really pleased to respond.
Yeah, that's a nice thing.
They
to
don't
find.
always respond, but
They don't always respond.
but
That's true.
sometimes they
That's true.
do.
Yeah. a
And
lot of
sometimes
times
they're
they
quite
will.
honored.
And I think it's more often than not that they will.
Yes.
Right? Because who doesn't want to hear, I read your work and I think a lot about it. You know, that's
Yeah.
pretty inspiring and
Yeah.
flattering. And any other questions from within the room here? Or online? We're good? All right. So let me end with this one.
Okay.
Ellen, what do you think is the toughest writing assignment you ever took on, whether it was a grant or something else?
Probably the one for 9/11, because it was, we were so fraught by the whole circumstance, and really trying to understand how to translate, to begin to translate an idea from a very specific illness with schizophrenia to trauma and differing cultural situations.
Yeah.
Again, as 3 white women, how are we going to do this? And I remember writing and rewriting and staying up late and trying to really think through how to do that in a way that was culturally sensitive. And we really wanted to work in the 4 communities. And then we kept thinking, is this too much?
Yeah.
But anyway,
But you went for it.
we
You
went
to
for
the
it.
4
Yeah.
communities.
Yeah.
And you're glad you did.
I'm glad we did.
Yeah. And any final thoughts you'd like to leave our audience with today?
No, I mean, I feel like, there are many people, at least, whether they're actually but they were on the list of attendees, of students that I've learned from, colleagues. The work is really interactional.
Yeah.
And I think that's it's never, to me, it's never, ever dull. So, it's always been very, very exciting work. And I feel like I've learned a lot. Social work is a lifelong learning experience. You never stop learning, and that's what makes it so fascinating. So that's what I would leave with.
Ah, that's a beautiful thing to leave with. Can we thank Dr. Lukens once again? And I'll just say this, when you're talking about these snippets,
Yeah.
I've written down a bunch that you gave me today. So thank you for that. One of
Yes.
them was advocacy becomes part of sustainability. I
Yeah.
think that's really beautiful and really important and very social work centered. So
Yeah,
thank
yeah,
you for
sure.
that. And then silence and dynamic silence,
Oh, I love that term.
right? I've never heard that before.
Me either.
And-
Until last week
Yeah,
from a
really?
physical therapist.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah,
Thank them.
she's a yoga teacher also. And I
Yeah.
was so fascinated by that term
Yeah.
because people are afraid of silence.
Yeah, so I was about to say, people, are,
Yeah.
there's fear.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And 10 seconds feels like too long for some folks.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. All
I-
right.
yeah.
Embrace the silence in your
Embrace the
writing and in
silence.
other
Yeah.
domains, I think. It's been wonderful. I did everything I hoped for. So thank you for doing this, Ellen. Really honored. Thank you, Linda and Peter Hoffman, for making this possible. And I'll close with this, listening to you talk about your work, Ellen, and knowing you as a colleague. I can only, I was picturing the parent you talked about and the clients you've worked with and how happy they must have been to be working with you.
Oh, yes.
For someone who's compassionate and kind. And I know you would never say this out loud, but you helped me at a very difficult time in my family life and just pointed me in the right direction. And that means the world to me. And I can just see how your compassion comes out with everyone you work with. So
Thank you.
thank you. All right.
Thanks.